I'm guessing that most of you don't know what a carbon tax is. It's a tool used by governments from around the world to reduce their carbon dioxide emissions and possibly even save the environment. But first, we need to focus on the history of the carbon tax. Then we're going to look at the effects that carbon has on the environment and then the future of the tax and legislation. Before we do any of that, we need to look at exactly what carbon is. If you remember from chemistry, carbon is the sixth element in the periodic table, is in every living thing. It can be formed as one of the hardest elements, diamond, and one of the softest, graphite. Now we need to know why people want to tax an element. So a carbon tax is a tax on actions that emit high doses of carbon dioxide, such as cars, burning of natural gases, and coal. For example, there might be a carbon tax of 5 cents per gallon of gas. This tax would promote new forms of transportation, cleaner sources of energy, such as wind, solar, or hydro. According to sustainable.com, Finland was the first country to introduce a carbon tax in 1990. Their tax started off at 1.12 euros per metric ton of carbon and has increased to 18.05 euros per metric ton of carbon by 2017. Since 1990, the number of countries that have a carbon tax has increased to 38. It's important to note that not every single country has a countrywide carbon tax. Some just have cities or states, such as in Canada, where cities like Vancouver or Toronto have their own tax, but not a Canadian-wide tax. The carbon tax has been introduced to hundreds of countries throughout the years, but almost all of them have been shot down because countries think it hurts business. But if every country would be willing to start reducing their carbon emissions, it could maybe even save the environment. It's been documented thousands of times by scientists that carbon in the atmosphere has increased massively since the Industrial Revolution, as you can see on this graph from Skeptical Science. The effects of carbon in the atmosphere has a huge impact on Earth's environment, as you can see in this graph, where the bars represent Earth's average temperature, and the line is representing the carbon emissions. As you can see, when the carbon emissions have been increasing, so is the Earth's temperature, and both are skyrocketing. This will impact every person in this room sooner rather than later. Some of the possible predictions for Earth's rising temperature are mass extinctions, environmental refugees, and almost the entire world being uninhabitable. Most of the damage has already been done and will only continue to get worse with increasing population and the increasing energy demand as well. But when we look to a carbon tax, it promotes newer, cleaner sources of energy that could possibly reduce the effects of global warming. But the only way this could ever possibly be done if the most powerful governments in the world start taxing carbon. It could cause a chain reaction where everybody starts to tax carbon. One thing that might convince countries to start taxing carbon is the Stern Review. The Stern Review looks at the economic effects of global warming. It was released in 2006 for the British government. Stern predicted that every country's total GDP would drop by 20% if Earth's average temperature increased by 2 degrees Celsius. This number has already convinced 38 countries to have a carbon tax and many others considering one as we speak. When we look to the United States, no single state has a carbon tax, and the only most recent and only one was in Washington State. And as you can see on here, this would be their revenue for their tax. And they proposed that it would have $25 per metric ton of carbon taxed, but it was rejected in 2016. It was a very progressive plan for the time, but many environmental groups have proposed more neutral plans to Congress, but none of them gained any steam to be passed. But many people suggest that many countries may never have a carbon tax until it's too late and the damage has become irreversible. The idea of taxing an element may be foreign to many of you, but today we've looked at the history of the carbon tax, the effect that carbon has in the environment, and the future of the tax and legislation. Today, I hope that we all learned that there's a possible solution to global warming, and possibly in the future we all may be way too familiar with the carbon tax. Thank you for your time.